Book 1, Law of Salimi, Chapter 15, Law of Salimi, the Tactician. As a student that was burning with inspiration from my meeting with Razli, I was becoming into a very dedicated student in my classroom. In my first semester as a new student, the following were subjects that I took during semester 1 in 1999 and 2000 session. I have accounting, English, IT or computer, Adasi, business maths and Islamic studies. I had six subjects being taught in English. It was quite shocking at first, but later I began to get used to reading and speaking with English language. In this chapter, I will go through in more detail of my study tactics for each subject. I wish that you, the reader, could benefit from this chapter if you are a student or have children who might be a student. At the very least, if you are an educator, including a teacher, lecturer, tutor, or professor at anywhere in this world, I hope my tactics might contribute in your life. If you had noticed, in my earlier chapters during primary and secondary school, I had never studied any subject that explored in the subject of accounting. Hence, at this level of academic studies, I was ultimately at a disadvantage. Everything that was taught in my classroom sounded like some ancient language that I had never heard before in my life. So, after my first class, I had realized this problem and thus confronted my lecturer about this problem. It was a good thing that I highlighted this issue as early as possible because I needed to solve it quickly. After the class, I went to meet up with the lecturer at her room to discuss possible solutions. I explained to her that I was from science background during my secondary school at Maktab Sabah. Without any basics in accounting, I was in trouble to understand even the simplest concept mentioned in class. So, she suggested that I read the book about the basic of accounting, which was meant for secondary level of education. I borrowed the book and made a photocopy with her permission. I spent my time to study everything that I need in order to understand the concepts of accounting. Despite of that, I regularly visited this lecturer to ask questions, regardless how stupid the question was. This female lecturer was extremely amazing at assisting me. Her willingness to help students like me can be considered as the best possible attitude that any educator should possess, in addition to the passion for knowledge. In several weeks, I was able to catch up with other students. Since I consider myself to be very poor in accounting, every time the lecturer gives any exercise as homework, I would ask her to give me double the amount so that I can practice and improve much faster. Later, I was getting bored having to wait for her to assign us homework during class. So I visited her room again and explained to her that I need more. I ended up borrowing several practice books from her and began practicing and doing everything in that book. Soon, I started to become much better in accounting. I started to borrow all of her books for my personal practice. She was willing to share her books and knowledge. She was happy to have met a student that was passionate to learn. After running out of practice book, she suggested that I should look at the library library for more resources. While scouring in the library, I discovered many helpful books. In addition, I also discovered at ITM campus Mangatal there was past examination questions available. I began to practice as much as I can using the past examination questions, but never managed to complete much due to lack of time. In the end, I managed to get ample knowledge to be considered as intermediate level student in accounting. I was good, but not the best, not yet. In the tactics of mastering the subject of accounting, I would recommend to be focused during class. Ask the lecturer for anything that you cannot comprehend and practice as much as you possibly can. Repeating the same question over and over again helps you to discover certain things that only experts might know. Continuous practice is the significant art in mastering this subject. Asking your lecturer for tips to improve your understanding and techniques managing in the accounts would also help greatly. Next was the subject of preparatory English. For those readers who are from English-speaking society, English should be an easy subject. For me, my English knowledge was just mediocre when I started to study at ITM campus Mangatal. I knew the very basic knowledge such as the grammar and what not, but I was never an expert in learning English, specifically in an official studies. At the beginning of my English class, I was rather struggling. However, I removed my shyness and I just don't care about my mistakes whenever I spoke my broken English. The more I spoke, more mistakes came out, but I do not care about it. It was funny to those who are experts in English language. Luckily for me, most of my friends were simply as bad as I was in the command of English language. Nevertheless, my tactics that I use to improve my English knowledge include listening to English songs, reading English books, or anything written in English, watching movies in English, which was rarely happening during my studies at ITM campus Mangatal, and speaking in English language with everyone that I met. I would also recommend reading newspaper written in English instead of the Malay language ones. I improved quite a lot since most books at the campus was in English language. In terms of speaking in English, it was quite difficult since most of my friends were too shy to use English language. Most students prefer Malay language with Sabahan slang. Hence, to remedy this problem, every time I visited any lecturer in their room, I did my best to speak to them in English language. They knew that my English was poor, but they also knew that I was trying my best to improve my language. I could sense that many of them were having a hard time trying to not laugh at my broken English, but I honestly do not mind at all. In addition to improve your grammar and the related knowledge in English, you could use practice books as well as past final examination papers for practice. Apart of that, I would also recommend writing anything, especially long essays in English language. Ensure that you could have someone who can check your essay and correct them. By practicing to write essays, you could improve your writing ability in English language rather effectively and efficiently. After several practices, you should have experienced the improvement in this subject. Mastery of English language requires a lot of time and consistency of using the language in your lifetime. Don't be shy to speak regardless how bad your English fluency. Trust me, it gets better as time passes. Practice, and practice some more. In my later time during in my later time during work. I was lucky enough to work in an environment that everyone speaks English in my office. It took me more than a year to finally be confident enough to speak English rather fluently. Computer and information processing refers to the subject of computers and information technology. This subject requires a passion towards technology as well as passion for knowledge. In this subject, I would generally recommend to focus during class and listen to every word that your lecturer said. Ask the lecturer directly if you cannot comprehend. Never delay to ask questions because the number of things that you do not understand might be accumulated and these will compound your problems. If the lecturer cannot answer your questions during class, request to visit your lecturer's room or set up appointments as much as needed. A great lecturer will always be willing to help any students who wishes to learn. If you need to identify certain specific things about the computer, using the hardware helps you understand better through visual aids. A part of that, looking at the actual pictures also help. If you have free time outside class, try to go to a computer laboratory and practice using the software as many times as necessary because it will serve as a good practice. It also helps you to understand and remember these steps. If you still have problems to remember, write the steps in numbers about every details involved in performing a specific task on the computer. All in all, this subject can be classified as a reading subject which requires memorization. I would prefer to use visualization method since my memory of abstract data and information was not very good to begin with. Having friends that knew about computer really helps, especially in trying to understand certain complex concepts in information and technology subject. Since I always loved video games, I was quite knowledgeable when it comes to this subject. During my free time, I always spend my time testing certain tasks using a computer. Adasi refers to a subject of Islamic studies which puts the teachings of Islam into practice. I love this particular subject because it enhances my knowledge about Islam as a way of life. This subject requires reading. If you wish to reduce the amount of time spent by reading, I would recommend talking to the scholars who are knowledgeable in Islam. I prefer the latter method because I could learn a lot more than can be learned simply by reading a textbook. I love talking to the Islamic scholars at ITM campus Mengatal because they are my inspiration and role model. I feel that they are already walking the path of a scholar that I was currently doing. Their vast amount of knowledge are a serious help to anyone who needs consultant. Most of these scholars are very open-minded and very passionate about knowledge. They love to learn as well as share their knowledge with others. All in all, speaking with any of these scholars saves a lot of time instead of spending hours alone by reading a book. Most of them have great life stories as well as excellent wisdom about everything in life. I wish to explore much more about them, but I have allocated at least one future chapters about them. Looking forward to start that chapter in this book. Business mathematics is a subject that includes both basic mathematics and some minor part of additional mathematics. It also includes formulas related to economic theories. This is a practical subject which requires practice, practice, and practice. After you had enough practice of this subject, you need more practice. Focus in your class. Ask questions if you are unable to understand and then start practicing with practice books. Past examination questions also helps you to practice more, especially the final examination questions from the past years. Since I love learning additional mathematics during my secondary school, this subject becomes a breeze for me. I love the subject because it is a problem-solving subject, which I am very passionate about. It is in line with my nature, which loves problem solving. Nothing much can be said about this subject except for practice, practice and practice until you puke for having too much practice. After you clean the mess of your spew, resume back to more practice. That was all about the tactics that I can say about this subject. Basic Islamic Studies is very similar to Adasi subject. In this subject, students are tested by answering questions and essays instead of practical examination in Adasi. Essentially, I would recommend a similar approach as explored in the subject of Adasi. This subject is also a reading subject which requires reading as well as speaking to Islamic scholars. Finally, those explanation covers all the tactics that I had used during my first semester studying at ITM campus Mangkatal. It was very basic and uses a lot of hard-working format. Don't worry though, because I did improve my study methods during the second semester. Throughout my first semester, I was hardworking and focused in my studies. I do not really spend any time doing anything else. I don't even have time to be bothered about the psychological warfare from my senior students. Even at the most crude form, my tactics did work for me. I really hope the reader can utilize at least a single benefit from the tactics explained in this chapter. Finally, my first semester ended with my final examination to determine my first academic performance as a new student. Honestly, I knew that I did my best in my studies. However, I cannot accurately gauge how my result might be. After the final examination, I began remembering my promise to Surazli, then the I promise document that I signed during the MWS week. Surazli got 3.70 CGPA and the I promise document stated that I need 3.75 CGPA. How do you think did I do in my first semester? Did the most famous new student suddenly become more famous, or did it fall into oblivion? I did not worry much about how I did because this is my special tactic that I utilize for answering final examination questions. Don't worry, I will explore these tactics in the upcoming chapters later in this story. How many tactics did I manage to develop during my first semester? As the title for this chapter suggests, I am the self-proclaimed tactician. This ends the chapter 15 of my first book. Thank you very much for listening and hope to hear you again for the next chapter.